want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion. I'm Fred Litwin, and on this episode we are going to once again separate fact from fiction, separate the wheat from the chaff, and we have a very, very special guest today. Our guest is Don Carpenter. Don Carpenter worked as a forensic accountant for 20 plus years. He's written 4 novels, a whole series of novelettes about New Orleans, but most importantly for our purposes, he is the author of this book, Man of a Million Fragments, the true story of Clay Shaw. And I have to tell you, this is one incredible book. I mean, it's magisterial. Nobody will come close to talking about Clay Shaw than this book. It's massive. It's several hundred pages, and it is wonderful. So, Don Carpenter, welcome to On the Trail of Delusion.
Thank you very much, Fred, for inviting me. And I wanted to correct just one thing. You said my series of novelettes is about Nashville, not New Orleans.
Right. Yeah, my mistake.
Oh, no problem.
So, Don, tell me, so what got you on to researching the life of Clay Shaw?
Well, I think it began in my youth. I worked in my dad's drugstore starting at age 10, and there was a customer, that was in 1966 to 67. There was a customer who lived in New Orleans previously, and he wanted to receive the afternoon New Orleans paper, the New Orleans States item. And so that would arrive every day about 3:30 in the afternoon or 4:30. And the Garrison case broke during that first year I was working in March of 67 or February. And there were these screaming headlines. The States item was not a tabloid like the National Enquirer, but it had a tabloidish look to it, big banner headlines. And so for months, once the case started, probably the next 6 months, there were constant headlines. That was the genesis of it. Of course, the case, I knew Clay Shaw. I didn't know too much of the details of the trial. I knew he was found not guilty. Then he was re-indicted because I remember asking my dad, I was having junior high civics by that time, how he could be re-indicted once he had been found not guilty. And my dad explained, well, it's for a different crime. And of course, that didn't get quite as much attention as the earlier charge, but it did. It limped along for a couple of years, and then it sort of disappeared in the early 70s and throughout the decade and then into the 80s. And the only thing that happened during that long period was I knew it was discredited in a general sense. I had read Counterplot by Edward J. Epstein, which covered about the early portions of that case. It never was a complete book. So it left, it kind of explained what began to go wrong, but it didn't explain everything. Then in 88, I believe it was, Jim Garrison published his book on the case. And I was, reading constantly at that time. I was in a bookstore getting ready to head out on a trip, thinking airport bookstore. I grabbed Garrison's book and read it. And I said, well, gosh, there must have been things I missed. I was taking Garrison's account at face value, and which is dangerous to do, as I learned. That was in 88. A few years go by, and then Gerald Posner writes his book, Case Closed. And also the ARRB, Assassination Records Review Board, is formed, and Larry King has numerous guests talking about what types of records they might come across and so forth. And the movie JFK comes out in 91. So there's a lot happening in that period. And I found the JFK movie very impressive as a movie. Still do. I think a young person not knowing anything else would find that just tremendously convincing. But I knew there were big holes in it of one sort or another. And when I read the book Case Closed, I actually learned a lot more about the wider Kennedy assassination than I ever knew. And I learned that there was a book called American Grotesque about the Shaw case, which I'd never heard of before. So I went to a bookstore and found that book by James Kirkwood. And that really was the modern genesis of where I got started. It was, I've called it one of the best books written about any major aspect of the Kennedy assassination, at least in my reading. I think that's an excellent book, particularly considering that Jim Kirkwood was not a JFK assassination expert, but he showed good judgment in filtering out fact from fiction. He brought to it he had a knowledge of Shaw personally, whom he had met. He was part of the gay community, as was Shaw. Other than, I guess one weakness of the book was maybe he didn't reveal things he could have revealed because of the sensitivity of the gay issue at the time. And you always kind of sense that, but it might make a reader wonder, what else is he not telling? You know, what else does he know that he's not telling? And so I kind of, with that framework, began. I read that book probably in the fall of '93. And in '94, I moved to Nashville. I was opening an office for my accounting firm. It was a promotion, a lot of work involved. But I began taking some trips whenever I could find the time to New Orleans to become a little more familiar with the landmarks, the old newspapers of that era, and perhaps maybe make a phone call or two to some of the individuals who might be mentioned in the Jim Kirkwood book. To kind of, I know I began to call the defense attorneys, Irvin Diamond, and I met with him in 1995. That coincided with the ARRB meeting in New Orleans that was held. And I was able to meet with Diamond, spend a day with him. He took me out to meet Billy Wegman. Edward was dead by that time, and Sal Panzica. So that was 3 of the 4 defense attorneys. And it was just a wonderful experience. I wish I had known a lot more before Mr. Diamond died, to ask him more about certain things that only he probably could answer even today.
Right, yes.
Primarily related to what Clay Shaw told him about his CIA connection and so forth. But Diamond died about 2.5 years after I met with him. And so during the 10 years from 94 to 2005, I really just worked piecemeal on the case. I came down to New Orleans. I wrote to certain individuals. For example, in 2002, I came down and talked to the husband of Nina Salzer, who's mentioned prominently in Shaw's book, Jeff, forget Jeff's last name, but I met with him.
Biddenson.
What was it?
Was it Biddenson or what's Jeff?
Not Biddison. No, it was Biddison was Shaw's friend.
Right.
There was Jeff Salzer was his name, and he was Nina Salzer's husband, and he was helpful. He knew a limited amount, and then I met with William Aldrich, who was one of Garrison's prosecution staff, who played a minor role at the trial, and I also had met with Steve Tyler, the documentary filmmaker, in '95 at that ARRB. So I was kind of branching out and meeting different people and kind of building a groundwork. But in 2005, in 2004, I had cut back from my workload. My younger partner was wanting to take over. I was kind of wanting to cut back. So we spent 2004 with that transition. And then in 2005, I went to status where I was doing only marketing work for the firm and not handling files. And I was only working about 3 days a week, kind of picking and choosing my time. So I had more time to research, to travel. And I began to order numerous documents through the National Archives. I had played with that in the 90s. I'd gotten all the Clay Shaw documents available as of 95, 96.
Right.
And there actually were quite a few available then. In fact, I think they released to me some things that weren't officially opened until later, I think by accident. But I learned a lot during that period. Jesse Core was another person I interviewed in the 90s who knew both Shaw and Garrison. And but 2005 was when I kicked off big time. I did a lot of work by mail and over the phone from 2005 to the middle of 2006. In late 2005, I was at a conference in Austin, Texas, and I went over to the LBJ library. And I went through certain things there, like the Drew Pearson diaries, because Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson had covered the case a little bit. Went through Drew Pearson's diary. And I'm trying to remember if I went through anything else there. But then in February of 2006, I went through James Kirkwood's papers at Boston University. And that was fascinating in its own right. Learned a lot more about James Kirkwood, but I learned also what he left out of the book that still survived. Now, whether he destroyed anything, I don't know. I specifically looked for anything Shaw had told him about the CIA connection or any kind of relationship he had with Garrison that might be worth knowing, because that issue pops up frequently in my research. And things like that. But I didn't really see a lot that wasn't in Kirkwood's book. There were a few things, but not much. There was the manuscript and the edits that went into it, but it looked like they were basically space edits. So if he had anything in there, it looked like maybe Kirkwood pre-edited it, if you will, or he didn't put it in to start with. So that was in early 2006. In September of 2006, I began making major trips to New Orleans and to the National Archives, week-long trips, sometimes working on the weekends. I started with collections at Historic New Orleans Collection and Tulane University. I began to dig into the extremely large International Trade Mart and International House collections, which are about 200 boxes of raw material. And there was some resistance to letting me in, but when they saw I was serious, they did. And once I got going, we had a great relationship. But that took several years to go through that.
I mean, my God, 200 boxes. I mean, that is incredible, the amount of work you did.
A wealth of information. And what I had no idea what was in it, but it turned out to be a wealth of information very relevant to Shaw's later involvement in the Jim Garrison investigation, as well as much needed personal background information about his relationships with different people, names and galore. And I then had to find out who those names were, how they met, what their relationship was, and so forth. It was the collection that kept on giving. But the Historic New Orleans collection had one that I had never seen, which was that Irvin Diamond's family had turned over whatever survived of Shaw's defense records that Irvin Diamond had maintained.
Yeah.
And there were things in there that were not in the Wegman collection at the National Archives and not in Clay Shaw's collection. So, including all the records of the private investigators that the defense team had hired to, help them with the case. So over the years, those two cities would become the most important. The Washington, D.C. area, the big National Archives at College Park, Maryland, and New Orleans, various collections in New Orleans, including Tulane, the City of New Orleans Public Library, the historic New Orleans collection. And then there's another collection out at Edith Stern's old residence that has to do with her papers and her relationship with Clay Shaw. And that I discovered that late, and that was interesting as well. And then there were ones here and there. The Boston University collections are very interesting. James Leo Herlihy, James Kirkwood. There's a Gerald Posner collection there now. And one I never made it to because at the late date, I kind of convinced myself it might not add that much, but others may have found differently, was the Richard Billings collection at Georgetown University.
I've been there.
Yeah, other people had given me documents from that commercial that they thought were ones they hadn't seen before. And so I thought I had that kind of under control, but in a way, I wish I had covered that base.
It's a pretty good collection. There's a lot of pictures, a lot of Life magazine pictures
Yes.
in that collection.
Yeah.
So I'm just blown away. How many interviews did you conduct for your book?
I'm going to guess, Fred, that it's over 100 interviews. I came to regard as very much a secondary aspect. I like to have hard documents from the era to begin questioning someone. But on the other hand, I would be glad to talk to anyone if that's all I could do. But I think those people filled in certainly background information on how they met Clay Shaw, how they knew him, in what context they knew him, and their thoughts on the Jim Garrison case and everything.
No, I'm absolutely blown away by how much research you did. I mean, you spoke to anybody who was alive at the time you spoke to, and the amount you went everywhere possible. I mean, it's pretty amazing how much research you did. I'm blown away by what you did. It's pretty amazing.
Well, it was an obsession. There's no doubt about it. And I had the time to do it. I realized it was a one-of-a-kind passion, and I poured my heart and soul into it. And I was exhausted at the end of it. I was, you reach a point in a project where, I'll be so glad to be done, and yet I don't want to let it go. Because I've met so many wonderful people along the way.
Right.
Most of them friends of Shaw.
So let's go into Clay Shaw. I mean, tell us a bit about Clay Shaw, and certainly he had quite an incredible career, particularly in the military. He really was quite a bit of a hero in the military.
Yes, Shaw was a person I admire very much. He's not a famous person like a political figure or a famous writer like Gore Vidal, say, or someone like that, or an actor. But he was a person who made the best and the most of what came before him, and also went looking for whatever he wanted to do that would help him and in which he was interested. So he was a high school graduate. I could never confirm that he really had any college, but he self-educated in a lot of ways. Sometimes even today, I don't know where he learned his public speaking skills, his confidence level, his poise. But he clearly learned from whatever he did. He started out working in the theater, probably learned a lot of presentation aspects of his life from there. He began to write and had a successful play or two on a small scale in the late 20s. And in fact, one of his, I don't know if it's still performed much today, but it's still out there kicking, and was performed at least into the 70s. And then he wrote others, and he moved to New York as part of, I guess he was a Western Union employee, actually. And it started with them in New Orleans. And but before I leave and get to his New York period, he met a person, I believe, during that early pre-New York period named Theodore Brent, who would later play a tremendous role in his career with the International Trade Mart. But he went to New York with Western Union, lived there for 7 years, And from there, he entered into World War II. While there, he tried to get into the theater in a major way. I think actually quitting his jobs at one point, but apparently that did not work. And he wound up with another job for the 3 years prior to World War II in New York City. So, and I learned, Fred, late in the game that apparently in the about a 4 or 5 month period in the middle of 1942, he came back to New Orleans and worked for two men who would later be his bosses after the war at the Trade Mart, Theodore Brent and Rudolph Hecht, and partly answered a mysterious question I had had from a letter that he was sent years later, which we can get into later. But I had no idea he had been in that. That he'd come back to New Orleans and then apparently went back to New York and got drafted and entered the Army at that point. So
It's also been about his career in the military in World War II.
in the military, he again took advantage of every opportunity along with being recognized for his skills. So he started out in the medical corps once he went through basic training, then he went to officer candidate school and became a lawyer. So being recognized as a potential officer alone was an achievement. And he took advantage of that and became what was then called a 90-day wonder because officers were turned out quickly. But he was shipped to England and was in the medical corps. And he worked there for about, I will say, he didn't get to England until late 1943. And he, around early 44, I believe, he was transferred on to General Charles Thrasher's staff, out of the medical corps and onto the general staff, where he was involved in public relations. And he worked with a fellow named Gordon Berger, who was a Canadian, who had joined the American Army, and I think he's still an American citizen at that point. But Gordon and I connected in 2005 and 6, and I met him in Montreal in 2006, and then he died a few years later. But he was Shaw's, I think, immediate superior in that public relations unit for a period of time, like a year or more. And during that period, they were involved while D-Day was being planned and things were extremely pressure-filled and chaotic. They then were involved in the move to France after D-Day, where they set up at a base in central France, and then onward to Berlin eventually. I think as the troops move forward. So.
Right.
And then toward the end of Shaw's stay on Thrasher's staff, really after the European campaign had ended in surrender, and in the summer of that year, Shaw began to do other things and move up the ranks on Thrasher's staff, and I think become kind of, I think Gordon Berger moved on, and Shaw got another promotion to major toward the end of his service, and then came back to the U.S. in the fall of that year to New Jersey, and then transitioned out in early part of 46.
Right. So, yeah, very storied, really, really fantastic career. And then he went to New Orleans and he opened up, I guess it's when he started the trade or planning for the Trade Mart.
Yes. I tried to find any correspondence between him and Theodore Brent or Rudolph Hecht during the war, but I could not. Any records that Brent had, either at Hibernia Bank or the old Mississippi shipping company that he ran called Delta Lines, I could never locate any records that survived of those. I even got in touch with someone who was prominent in Mississippi Shipping Company years later, and his wife, who was the survivor, told me, she didn't know how to help me. She just wasn't aware that any of that had survived because there had been so many takeovers and bankruptcies related to shipping and banking and so forth. So, but anyway, when Shaw got back in January of 46, he has no job, But I do see that in the trademark records, very detailed information on how he came to be hired. And Theodore Brent was the person who hired him. He wrote a memo to the board saying that he had hired Clay Shaw. He knew him and trusted his facility of mind, was the phrase he used, and believed that he had the skills to market the trademark, handle all the public relations, and run the trademark, and was a good organizer. And that was that. Brent was the top figure, and I think he was a figure of very much authority. And if he said it, everyone else trusted him. They not just went along with it, they trusted him. And that was that. And he was hired on, and you immediately began to see the public relations letters that he wrote, and the individual letters that he wrote beginning in January 46. And the records while Shaw was in charge of the trademark for a 19-year period, well, almost 20, were very well organized and very detailed. It's like nothing was thrown away. And so for any Clay Shaw scholar, they are a wealth.
And his big project, of course, was building the new Trade Mart.
The new Trade Mart, what was the project involved? Taking an old building that had been built in the 1890s, I believe, called the Baldwin Building, remodeling it, basically gutting it and redesigning it inside. It was a project that took, I'm not sure when that began, but it was before Shaw got back to New Orleans, probably in 45 sometime, and continued on. The Trade Mart actually opened unofficially in June of 48, and the grand opening was in, I think, November of 48. But before that 2-year plus period were all kinds of trips Shaw made, both marketing and public relations, attempts to get leases signed, supervise other leasing reps that he had in the outlying areas. And, he's very well occupied, but he did take numerous trips himself and gave numerous speeches during that time.
And he was, of course, very, very busy in 1963 with building of the new Trade Mart building.
Yes, and that actually was the type of project that had many starts and stops. It had been in the works as an idea really for about 10 to 12 years before it actually opened, probably 12 years. But probably around 1953-54 is when the idea germinated that International House and International Trade Mart would both need new buildings. And it was hoped they would stay joined together, but eventually they split. And we can get into that if we need to later. But yes, I would say the serious efforts to design a building began around 1958, went through a couple of architectural firms. Edward Stone was selected as the main architect around that time. But there were several failed attempts to sell all the leases that did not succeed in order to get bank financing. And it was only through really a Herculean effort in the early 60s where the particular package that was put together, the design of the building, I guess perhaps change in banking conditions, everything worked, but it was still touch and go and had to be done in a certain period of time or it wouldn't work, but it all came together.
Right.
And so the building began construction, and it was finished pretty much by 1965 and opened to tenants shortly before Hurricane Betsy hit. And then there was major damage. And I think the grand opening got delayed quite a while until after Shaw left. I think he was hoping to be around for the grand opening, but when I think he had already targeted October 1st, 65 as his retirement date. So he stuck with that.
So why did Shaw retire in 1965?
I have a speculation. I think he was tired of the project. I think he had been through it. I don't know. I'm not sure he was up to the newer, bigger, or trademark design, and there was a feeling it should be more international than it had been, and perhaps more international travel and so forth. That may have been part of it. He may have just wanted to do other things. I mean, I went through this same period myself. He was kind of my inspiration when I retired,
Right.
and how to do it, And I think, but I also often suspect, without knowing it completely, that with the passing of Theodore Brent in 1953, and then Rudolf Hecht in early 1956, and the ascension of, now that for a 6-year period, there was William Zetzman as the president. And I think he and Shaw got along fine. But I think once Lloyd Cobb became the president in the early 60s, I don't know exactly how they got along on a day-to-day basis, but I have long suspected there was a little more tension there than Shaw liked. Lloyd Cobb could be a little bit of a control freak.
Right.
And you see that in the years after Shaw steps down. Lloyd Cobb basically gets in and runs the Trade Mart himself, even though he's still a full-time lawyer, for a number of years, I would say into the early 70s. And I have long suspected he and Shaw just didn't get along to the extent that Shaw wanted for him to stay in the job. And I have nothing in writing on that or anything, but there is some earlier correspondence between the two, and you can see that Cobb takes a sharper tone with Shaw than Brent or Hecht or Zetzman did.
Right.
Particularly Zetzman, who pretty much was hands off, knowing Shaw had the trust of Brent and Hecht. So until the early 60s, Shaw was rocking along fine. But, he may have been just tired after the project started to build.
Do you think any of the tension might have been related to Shaw's homosexuality?
I don't know that. I've never seen anything that I could hang my hat on that reflected that on Cobb's part.
Right.
He is, I know during the testimony at the trial in 1969, he made it clear that he and Shaw weren't social friends. They didn't see each other much after work, but that could be nothing more than what it was. So no, I never saw anything I could point to in that regard, but I did wonder about it.
Okay, so Shaw retires, and basically he retires to a life of sort of writing plays and restoring property. It seems like sounds like a good life for him living in the French Quarter.
Yes, he retired in late '65. He gave up his membership in International House and what's the social club there in New Orleans where they used to have the nude swimming, the athletic club, New Orleans Athletic Club, and other things that he had been part of from a business perspective. And yes, he takes a long trip to England in the summer of '66. And I was able to interview through email a hitchhiker that he picked up in England, who kept a detailed diary and remembered Shaw from that summer. And but yeah, he came back, and the fall of '66, his father passes. He goes to Hammond, Louisiana, and there's the funeral. And then he's back here in early '67, living at home and just doing his thing. And then this, suspicion hits and knocks him off his feet in early '67.
Yeah. So what do you think led Jim Garrison to suspect or think of Clay Shaw in terms of the JFK assassination?
Well, I think it was two things, and then a third lesser important thing. One was the information he got from Jack Martin back in 1963 that Ferry was involved in the assassination, David Ferry. The other was the Dean Andrews connection about receiving a mysterious phone call from a mysterious client of his named Clay Bertrand, whom he could not specifically identify, asking him to represent Oswald in the case. Dean Andrews identified the man as a homosexual. Dean Andrews represented a lot of gay people who had been arrested on minor crimes like pandering and solicitation and so forth, and was familiar with that community, at least on a lower level or street level, if you will. And so taking those two strands and the name Clay, of course, Garrison began to kick around early on. Once he got the idea to look into the assassination, the idea of putting those two strands together and the name Clay really were at the beginning in his mind. And I'll get back to him in a moment. The third thing was, once Shaw was identified as being Bertrand in Garrison's mind, then Clay Shaw also had a lot of dealings with the Latino community because of the Trade Mart. One aspect of the Latino community was the Cuban community. There was a large anti-Castro Cuban community in New Orleans who had begun to be associated with being anti-JFK because of the Bay of Pigs and how it had been handled by JFK. Now, the Cuban community was never really an active part of the Trade Mart. They had a consulate there, but they fell behind on their rent. Shaw let them stay for a while, then I think kicked them out. But they were never as active as the Colombian contingent because Mario Bermudez was a big part of that. And there were just many Colombians in that era who were participants in the Trade Mart, and they were the major Latino country. There weren't many Brazilians or Argentinians or Peruvians. It was Colombians, and then to a minor degree, all the other Latino countries. So the Cubans were not a big part of that, and Shaw had no association with the anti-Castro Cuban community. But Garrison didn't know that, probably didn't want to know it. So those three things led into the identification of Shaw as one of the people Garrison was interested in, only one of many. And then Shaw was interviewed in December of '66. He answered their questions, and when he left, I think Garrison pretty much thought, there's nothing here. And I don't think it would have happened, Fred, except for Andrew Shambra, who was one of Garrison's green behind the ears assistant district attorney. I think he started right around the time Garrison was starting to look into the case. And he wanted to make an impression. And it was really him that put Shaw and Ferry together. I don't even think Garrison had made that connection in any real serious way. And I don't think that occurred until maybe the middle of February. Everything seems to come together from the middle of February through Ferry's death like a week later. And the news of the case broke in between those two things. And then once Ferry died and could not speak, Perry Russo emerges, and he becomes the main witness who can at least sort of put Shaw and Ferry together even before he's hypnotized.
Right.
And then once Russo undergoes both sodium pentothal and hypnosis, you have the Clay-Shaw connection that leads straight into the indictment and the arrest. So that was it in a nutshell, in my opinion.
Yeah, one of the theories that I have about the case is that back when the FBI and the Secret Service were investigating Dean Andrews, I guess there was a feeling that it was a figment of his imagination back then, and I think that word may have filtered back to Garrison that there was really nothing there. I think he knew about what Dean Andrews was saying back there because it had reached into Garrison's office. It was Dean Andrews who actually called Garrison's office asking about if they had records about Clay Bertrand. But I think what happened to me, my theory is that Dean Andrews then testifies before the Warren Commission, repeats the story about Clay Bertrand, but nobody knew that Andrews had done that. until Whitewash comes out. So Weisberg's Whitewash comes out. Dean Andrews is featured all over that. And I think Garrison then read Whitewash and was surprised to see that Dean Andrews had resuscitated the whole Bertrand story. And I think that led to Garrison immediately calling Andrews for dinner to discuss it.
Well, you may be right. And I actually wasn't aware of that connection. I didn't know when Garrison had read Whitewash. I knew he must be familiar with it. But yeah, Andrews not only, I don't know if he recanted his story, but he said it might be a figment of his mind. Maybe he dreamed it or something. But it's pretty clear, there were no client records in his office of ever having represented Oswald or Bertrand. There were his secretary didn't know anything about, Bertrand. The description of Bertrand he gave to the FBI is laughable. I think he says he was blonde and 22 years old.
Yeah.
Most people who've researched the case either aren't familiar with that or somehow explained it away. And I think you're right. I think when he sat down with the Warren Commission, after he had pretty much forgotten about what he even said, probably was amazed they even bothered to interview him. I think he sat down with a very naive Wesley Leibler, I guess is his name, and I never met him or talked to him, but he seemed terribly naive in talking to Andrews and did not seem to realize he was dealing with a person that anyone in New Orleans would know never told the truth under any circumstances and never let being under oath change that view at all. Dean Andrews, I'm not sure he could relate what you both saw yesterday and knew and had already discussed. He could relate it factually the next day without adding something or subtracting something. So I think Wesley Leibler, Dean Andrews saw that he was taking him seriously and wasn't picking up on even contradictions in his testimony. And it produced this full transcript that, yes, researchers jumped on once they got hold of it.
Yeah, I was also struck that Dean Andrews said later that every now and then somebody would come visit him in New Orleans to talk about his Warren Commission testimony, and he didn't want to talk about it. And it was never in the papers that he testified. Like there was no big story. Oh, Dean Andrews testifies before the Warren Commission. So I think people really didn't know.
Right.
And of course, not that many people were examining the 26 volumes of evidence when it came out. So it did come out in Whitewash.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the whole, I'm always struck by just how little evidence Garrison had against Clay Shaw when he arrested him. I mean, it's really quite frightening to think, oh my God, I've got this, basically just the hypnosis and sodium pentothal interviews, and that's enough to arrest him.
Yes. And I think that was an important part of the decision years later by the federal judge, Judge Christianberry, to stop the prosecution cold, but 4.5 years later. Yes, he really had Perry Russo, and he had, during the time between the arrest and the preliminary hearing, which is a short 2-week period, he found Vernon Bundy, who, wanted to be a cooperating snitch, if you will. And they refreshed his memory, and he became another person who said he saw Shaw and Oswald together. And so by the time of the preliminary hearing, he had another flimsy witness, but the defense was working blind entering that hearing. And they did a good job, really, of uncovering what they needed to uncover to help them going forward. And I think they knew by the end of it, there wasn't much there. The question is just, how do we deal with this to make it go away? And I think they thought it would be much simpler than it turned out to be. But you're right. There was nothing other than a manipulated, as we know now, Perry Russo, who was shaky to begin with. And let's refresh just two things. Perry Russo had said he may or may not, he knew Ferry and he may or may know something that might be helpful. And he told at least 2 or 3 interviewers before he even talked with Garrison's office after his name became public that he did not know Oswald and never heard of him until the assassination. So all that went out the window very quickly.
Yeah, did you ever interview Perry Russo?
No, he passed in the summer of '95 before I really got into serious knocking on doors.
Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, he died very, very young, which is very, very unfortunate.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just struck by Perry Russo, is sort of a tragic figure who sort of got ensnared. You know, he got himself involved into this and then sort of couldn't extricate himself from Garrison's grasp in a way.
Yes. I think Jim Kirkwood said it best. I'll paraphrase here. He said, if someone had come along, because Russo liked coaching softball, if someone had come along and told him, Perry, if you coach this team and you do pretty well, I think there's a good chance we can get you the trophy for coach of the 5 parish area, including Orleans Parish and the 5 surrounding parishes. Russo would have gone for that over getting involved in this case. That would have been enough to stroke his ego. But he was a person who wanted some type of recognition. The case offered him that. I think once he agreed to be a part of it in any small way and they agreed to hypnotize him, they then were able to tell him once he came out of the sodium pentothal and the hypnosis, this is what you said while you were under them, and you've got to stick with that now or we would have to charge you. That was all he needed. And then they told him probably you can get on board with us and ride the wave, in effect, not necessarily those words, but Russo decided to ride the wave. And
yeah, I think, I'm sorry. I think he also was led to believe there was other evidence besides himself. And
definitely
was surprised that he was the key person.
That's a key element of prosecutorial misconduct or police misconduct, is to tell someone, we have all these things. We just need one person to fill in this gap. And that's what we need you to do. And Russo, I think another thing was he didn't foresee there would be 2 full years before Shaw's case went to trial. He thought it would be over and done with, and he would be done with it. And I think he began to grow very weary of it no later than by the end of 1967. And definitely by the summer of '68, when he began to have to testify in some of the federal proceedings that Shaw's lawyers had initiated to try to get rid of the case. And I think he was ready to be done with it. He just didn't know how to say it publicly without getting himself in legal trouble.
Yeah, so I feel a bit sorry for him. Shaw is acquitted. And then 2 days later, Garrison charges him with perjury.
That's right.
And so, what do you think? First off, I mean, do you think Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand? I just sort of have to ask the question.
No, I don't think there was a Clay Bertrand.
Right. And so, do you think Clay Shaw knew David Ferry or Lee Harvey Oswald?
No. In fact, I guess I'm one of that small minority that don't even think Ferry and Oswald knew each other. I understand there's a photo that I think I have seen a few times that, that could be Oswald in the photo. I've never completely gotten comfortable that it is Ferry and Oswald in that same photo, but they don't seem to be paying attention to each other. And when you're in a group years earlier, you get your picture taken with many people that you don't even know who they are.
Yeah, well, the person who actually took that picture told, I think, Gus Russo or Patricia Lambert that he didn't think that Ferry would recognize him either. Oswald only went to Cap a couple of times.
Yeah.
Why would a teacher there recognize a student who only been there a couple of times 8 years later?
Right. I've been in accounting associations, and I I used to do a lot of work for the insurance claims industry. I've been in claims association meeting pictures, and yeah, I had no idea who was in the photo with me.
Yeah, if you come look at all my photographs, I've got lots of pictures of me and groups of people, and like there's certain people I don't know who they are.
Yeah. So I've never seen any evidence that Ferry and Oswald knew each other, and Ferry always denied it. And I don't know of any reason he would have denied it factually that he knew Oswald in the 50s.
Yeah, and in fact, Ferry said that, oh, you know, the picture of Oswald looks somewhat familiar. And Edward Vobel then called Ferry and said, well, you know, by the way, you and Oswald were in cap together. And then what I find interesting is Ferry then called the FBI and said, you know what, we were in cap together. I don't really remember them that well, but we were in cap. I mean, here's a suspect calling the FBI to say, yeah,
yeah. Actually, I don't know that I knew he had called the FBI and said he and Oswald were in there together. That may put a different slant on what I think about it. But if they knew each other, it was nothing more than that.
It was nothing. It was nothing. And so, you know, what do you take? I mean, what really gets me going is you've written this amazing book. It is the book on Clay Shaw. Nobody else will ever write such a great book on Clay Shaw. I mean, it really will. This will stand hundreds of years from now. People will refer to your book. 2 questions. Number 1, it does not appear that conspiracy theorists read your book. And number 2, it appears that all these people who believe that Shaw was involved in the JFK assassination don't really seem interested too much in his life at all.
Exactly. Well, as far as why people in the conspiracy world don't read it, I think they tend not to read books that they don't agree with. They don't want to read anything that might undercut what they believe. Sometimes you get a little cross conspiracy rivalry where a person like David Lifton, who never trusted Garrison and didn't like his case from pretty early on, might read an anti-Garrison book.
Yeah.
Or a book that has that slant. But I think when they saw John McAdams' name on the reviews, that was the kiss of death for any conspiracy theorist right away, because John was a pretty crusty fellow and was pretty much, maybe hated is a strong word, but I think he was hated by many in the conspiracy theory world. So those 2 things. The reason I wanted to do a biography that also tied into the case was I had come to the conclusion that in my own mind, I would only be able to decide if Clay Shaw either had any involvement or if there was any truth to him knowing any of the major characters, that I could only figure that out by knowing about his life. And to the extent I could learn who he was, I didn't really know what the Trade Mart did. I knew what it was kind of generally supposed to do, but the nuts and bolts of it, I had no idea until I dug into the collection. And so it was an eye-opening experience. And another reason I got involved in it was I was disappointed that no New Orleans historian had written about it before with any depth or objectivity. There have been biographies of Huey Long by Louisiana historians. There have been Leander Perez, but there haven't been many of those really by New Orleans or Louisiana people. So sometimes the local historians in New Orleans don't always seem to, dig into characters or biographies of famous people.
But the other point, is if you go to, like, I've been to the National Archives, you have, there's all these boxes of Clay Shaw's papers, and you go to the conspiracy bulletin boards, and they'll talk about Oswald over and over again, but nobody talks about Clay Shaw, even though they might think he was involved, and I find that really they don't care. I mean, it's just sort of I find that very, very strange.
He's become a prop in my mind over the years. The case was over. There were certain critics of the case, even within the conspiracy community, so it was never unanimous. The 70s, it pretty much died. What happened is when Garrison resurrected it, and Oliver Stone decided to make a movie of that book and Crossfire, which was like an encyclopedic study of the various theories, a catch-all for them, really. Clay Shaw is the one person that is identified as a person that stood trial for the Kennedy assassination. You have to remind people sometimes that Ruby stood trial for shooting Oswald, but Clay Shaw is the only person that's really been identified, not as being the assassin, but as ironically as knowing the assassin, even though a lot of the same people claim that person, Oswald, wasn't really the assassination. And Jim Garrison claimed both of those things.
That's right.
And I remember someone confronted his lead prosecutor, Jim Alcock. How can you say that Shaw conspired with Oswald to commit the assassination when Garrison's out saying Oswald wasn't the actual assassin?
Yeah.
So anyway.
So one question, going back to James Kirkwood and what he may have known, but in the interview with Irvin Diamond, Diamond talks about the fact that he had a secret weapon that he had that convinced or helped convince Garrison not to use the issue of homosexuality in the trial. And then the tape gets turned off. So we don't really know exactly what Diamond had in his possession. Do you have any idea what Diamond was talking about?
You know, Fred, I have no definite answer. It's one of those mysteries that may have died with Irvin Diamond, I fear. I've speculated in my own mind that it either had something to do with something Diamond had gleaned about either Garrison himself on the personal side, or perhaps Chambra himself. You know, Rousseau, and I don't know what your conclusions are, but Rousseau, I think, either was bisexual or basically gay, but had a heterosexual side. But I think Rousseau could have carried on with some of the prosecutors, like maybe Chambra. I know when the recording resumes, and I'm glad to know they've fixed some of these recordings where you were able to hear them, because the one with Diamond was very good and entertaining. They were talking about maybe Jim Phelan told Kirkwood something like, I know Chambra brought a mistress along when Phelan confronted Chambra at Garrison's home, and Garrison's wife was upset about that. You know, all those DAs had mistresses back in that time. I know whether it was something related to that or something on the gay side where some of them had dallied in that world. I just don't know. I wish I did.
Yeah.
It had to be something he could fire back on the same level, though, because Diamond did not like challenging the prosecutions in general in court. He wanted to be able to attack their witnesses better, and less a blanket attack on Garrison's office. He discusses that here and there. So yeah, it would have to be something pretty specific that Garrison would say, yeah, don't reveal that, or something, but I don't know what it was.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Let's talk a bit about Shaw and the CIA. And
Okay.
In fact, Shaw was a domestic contact of the CIA from 1948 to 1956, and of course, conspiracy theorists believe he was a lot more than that. So, why did Shaw hide this?
Fred, there's a question in my mind as to whether Shaw knew the people he was meeting with were actually with the CIA.
Yes.
The office in New Orleans was located in the building where the State Department was, the old Masonic Lodge. And in the one letter I found that he wrote to Hunter Leak, his CIA contact, he doesn't address it to the CIA. He just addressed it to Hunter Leak at that address. He could have been made aware verbally that you're not supposed to reveal this, but as far as I know, he never signed any agreement to that effect. And maybe he felt telling Diamond was enough if he told Diamond. That was one thing I would have loved to have asked Diamond. So, yeah, I don't know why he never revealed it, but I think he at least suspected, because he worked with David Baldwin in the 1950s. And David Baldwin had actually been a covert agent who had been fired from the CIA in India in the 1952 for getting involved with a woman, and apparently some type of secret material transferred to that woman and went on where the CIA did not want it to go. And so Baldwin was fired, came back to New Orleans where he was from, and he was hired for about a year. Well, he worked with Shaw on the Sesquicentennial Commission in 1953 for a year. Then he followed Shaw back to the Trade Mart for about a year and 5 months as the public relations man. And he, I do wonder if Shaw and he talked about the CIA. Baldwin was kind of a devil-may-care, swashbuckling kind of guy, and he probably could run his mouth pretty good, and he might not feel he was bound by any oath.
I think that if Shaw had said something in 1956, I'm providing some information to the CIA on East Bloc trading stuff, people would have said back then, "Oh, well, good on you. You're a loyal American."
Mm-hmm.
But if you had said that in 1967 or 68, then it'd be, "Oh my God, you're evil. You're involved with the CIA." I mean,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Attitudes towards the CIA had really changed dramatically over the years as well.
Definitely. Shaw's arrest almost coincided with these groundbreaking articles in Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson's column revealing the mafia connections. I think those were the initial ones that began to reveal that, and other, the CIA being involved in Castro's assassination attempts and so forth. So yes, all that was going on at that same moment.
Yeah, I'm hoping at some point somebody writes a good history of the Domestic Contact Service. I'd like to know more about how it was named and talked about. 1948 was right when the CIA was formed, so that's really early days of domestic contacts, and so it might very well have been completely under the auspices of the State Department.
I made a major effort to try to get the CIA to release all the names of people that were domestic contacts from the time the office opened in 48 through at least the end of 1949. And then I also asked later for 1951, but I made no headway. So apparently they regard all that as still, they'll release it when they decide to. But yeah, that would have been a welcome addition to put in context. Okay, Shaw was there, but look at all these other 50 people. I mean, I have to believe that Charles Nutter, who was the international house person and traveled much more internationally than Shaw, and had worked as a newsman in Argentina and in the old Soviet Union under Joe Stalin in the 1930s, that he was much more useful than Shaw. And also Mario Bermudez, who was really the liaison between New Orleans and the Latino community all throughout South America, Spain, the Caribbean islands, and so forth, and was very, of course, fluent in Spanish and English. A very colorful character on a lot of levels. But yeah, I think his major information to the CIA came in 1949 and 1951, 2 lengthy trips he made to South America. And after that, his information was basically cryptic paragraphs, either speculation or, just passing on information he heard at the Trade Mart. I mean, very limited. like one thing a year, maybe.
Yeah, and he stopped in 1956. Do you think that might have been related to the fact that Shaw was also not flying as much? He was not going places as much.
That's right. He traveled to Mexico in 1955, and from that point on through the end of his Trade Mart time, he did not make another international trip, except that in 1958, he went to Puerto Rico for a month to help them set up their own International Trade Mart.
Well, what about
And so, yeah.
what about Shaw's trips to Italy for board meetings of Permindex?
Well, I searched in vain for those passenger records, and actually, there's good correspondence where Shaw advises them he won't be able to come there either because things are busy with trying to get the new building going, and the board of directors probably would not have authorized that type of expense. And he tells several people he didn't really know much about that organization to start with. He joined it because they asked him to join the board, and after the Trade Mart people checked out the reputation of the people behind it and determined they were, quote, good people, unquote, they allowed him to put his name on it. But that was all he really knew.
Yeah, it was funny. I don't know if you saw, but I got a copy of Paesa Serra from February 1962, which is when Permindex or CMC closed their doors.
Okay.
And they closed their doors. They hadn't paid their rent since 1960.
Yeah.
They didn't have enough tenants to pay their rent, and it's like, why is it that all these CIA-associated organizations, the CIA, they can't even pay their rent? I think of Guy Bannister, who got turfed out of 531 Lafayette when he couldn't pay his rent for 11 months. I think the CIA would pay a little bit of money to these people.
Did you ever interview Paul Fabry, who was
No.
was with International House? He replaced Charles Nutter in the early 60s, and I think Paul is finally deceased, but he must have hit 100. But wonderful man, very stern, Hungarian, and when he gave me a good review on his own without me asking for it, I think that his review meant more than any single person. Look, he was definitely a brook no fools type of person. But he told me that the young man that was involved in Permindex, and I guess the Rome Trade Center. I won't try to an Italian pronunciation here, but he was the child of someone who had been a prime minister in Hungary before the war and before the communists took over. And I gathered that project was for him, and that there were some people who had connections behind it. So maybe he got by with paying the rent, or they got by with paying the rent for an extended period because of maybe they had some political connections in the Italian government. And that organization may have had an aspect that touched on the Cold War. I don't know what you found out. And I think that there is some CIA material that maybe the CIA did. I don't know if co-opt is the right word or if that's the word the CIA used, but they had an interest in it and they did something.
Well, what I found was Frank Nagy went to the CIA and asked them if they wanted to put somebody either on the board or on the staff of Permindex.
Okay.
And then they wrote a memo analyzing Permindex and basically said, it's not that interesting because of the way they're organized. They're not going to do that much work with the East Bloc. And so it's just not that interesting to us.
Yeah.
And so I think the CIA declined to do that. But of course...
Yeah, go ahead.
But this was all, after Clay Shaw had already been on the board. So it wasn't, Clay Shaw was not their guy.
Right. No, Clay Shaw never did anything related to that organization. He had more people writing to him asking what the organization was all about, and him telling them he did not really know.
Yeah.
And that was probably the sum of his activity, while being on the board, or answering their inquiry about could he come to Rome for, a board meeting.
I got one more question before we sort of wrap up. One question on Clay Shaw. Do you think Clay Shaw was in Clinton with Oswald and Ferry?
No, I don't. I think I believe I gave you some correspondence from former Congressman John Rarick,
Yeah.
who Rarick was my congressman for the period from 1967 through 75 when I was turned 18 or 19. And Rarick, my dad was a big supporter of Rarick. He was fighting the civil rights movement, and my dad was unfortunately of that belief. And he defeated a longtime Congressman, Jimmy Morrison, who may have voted for one minor civil rights bill and got defeated by Rarick. Rarick, I will say this, in spite of my disagreements with him, I think he was a terrible racist. I think he was an honest man. He had been a judge, and I think he was an educated man. He was a Northerner from Indiana. And I think he, unfortunately, fell into the segregationist, racist doctrine. But I think he was honest, and I think he, without saying it directly in that letter, if I recall, he basically said that, yes, he knew there was some sort of mysterious sighting that occurred in Clinton around that time frame, but he never heard the names Oswald, Ferry, or Shaw until the Garrison case broke years later. So I think when Garrison's case broke, it was a very specific break in the case, if you will, in that it named certain names and faces and put faces on them. And I think some people in outlying areas of the country or Louisiana said, maybe that was the person or the people we saw here that day back in 1967. Now, whether there also had been rumors of Oswald coming up to the hospital there to try to get a job, or whether all that was also just came about at the same time, I don't know. It's a mystery. I don't know if you ever saw the full version of that Rough Side of the Mountain.
No, I haven't. I would love to see it. I've actually corresponded with the producer, trying to convince him to put it online.
Yeah, he I think Steve Tyler did and didn't make much headway, but John McAdams had a lengthy clip that he posted some years ago that was much longer than anything I'd seen. And I think the district attorney at that time, Richard Kilbride, basically shot down the whole thing, if you accept his version, that this thing was just kind of, it emerged after Garrison's case emerged in the media. Yeah. And I've never seen anything credible about it. It looked like, from what I saw, Garrison's men were up there pretty early, as early as, say, late March of 67. And the Counselor, have you been through the Counselor newspaper?
I have, and I've also been through, I have all of Van Dishler's notes.
Okay.
And I think, one thing that really strikes me about the Clinton witnesses is, had there been discovery in Louisiana courts in 1967 to 1969, would Garrison have used those witnesses? Because then Shaw's attorneys would have had all of the Garrison's investigative reports, which were quite contradictory.
Oh, yeah. If there'd been discovery of the kind, think of the William Kennedy Smith rape trial in 1991, where Roy Black, the defense attorney, was able to depose every single witness, the prosecution, including the woman making the accusation, before the trial started. And then the prosecution could not depose William Kennedy Smith, whatever you take on the case. But it was just so much different. And Florida may be an extreme in that direction. I don't know how much you can actually take depositions state by state. But that's certainly, if you can do it in a civil case, why not a criminal case?
And by the way, you the letter you gave me about John Rarick. What's interesting is that it was a Palmer of Manchester also said that Rarick was there. And so, you have this, Rarick says, yes, somebody was there, but I never heard Shaw or Ferry. And then Palmer or Manchester said, yes, Rarick was there as well. So there's confirmation that Rarick was there.
Yeah. Well, he was, not far from downtown Clinton. I think his office actually was in Clinton. Maybe he lived in St. Francisville, which is nearby. But yeah, Rarick was that was his area, and yeah. Anyway, I trust Rarick's honesty, even if I don't agree with his political views.
Okay, it's just to look, you're so you know so much about this. We'll have to come back for a second interview, but
okay, I'd be delighted to.
Just tell me a bit about the legacy of Clay Shaw and Clay Shaw's life and what it means, and what Clay Shaw means to you.
Well, I think he's a person I would have liked very much. I think it's kind of strange. He shares the same dry sense of humor that I have. I see that reflected in even his small letters that he would answer Trade Mart inquiries. Kind of a little bit of a devilish side of him where he'd work a double entendre in occasionally. And he also had a judgmental side that I liked. You know, we were often told not to judge people, but, you know, Shaw was the one that I read the quote, "Tyranny of the weak." There was a wealthy woman that lived in the quarter that was a friend of his. And actually, let's see what his connection was. She eventually either bought a building she did buy a building from him and was making mortgage payments to him. And she was out of Houston, I believe. And she had a sister who was like a woe is me type person. And Shaw referred to the tyranny of the weak in that relationship because the stronger sister just spent a lot of time catering to the weaker sister for no other reason than the weaker sister had learned she could manipulate the stronger sister. And, you know, Shaw made those remarks, and he could make remarks about people that were making a judgment of sorts, but they were truthful, they were factual. And I have that quality too. I don't see the point of just always saying something buttery about someone if something else factual needs to be said, but without saying you need to be unnecessarily harsh. So he was a realist, and I like that he took advantage of what he could and raised himself up. I mean, when he got back from the war, I'm sure he had almost no money, and within 20 years, he had put enough aside to, if this had not happened, retire on and live the rest of his life. And even though it did happen, with a little more help, or a lot of help from Edith Stern, he made it through. And but he did have to go back to work for a while. So yeah, he wasn't a complainer. He put his shoulder to the wheel and did what needed to be done. And he was much better than me at not alienating people. I mean, Clay Shaw had a very high percentage of the people he came in contact with who thought highly of him. And only a small portion had something against him, something mysterious. And I admired that quality and have tried to figure out his secret in the years that I've been working on the project. So yes, I think of Clay Shaw very highly. I often quote small things he said very commonly that never turn up in a Bartlett's book, but I've gleaned from his correspondence, basically, or seeing him in an interview, maybe.
Yeah.
He always had a twinkle in his eye, too, you know, where he's...
Yeah. Yeah, and I just think, wow, you know, he led an amazing life, and it's just so sad that a great retirement where all his friends were in the French Quarter, and his loves of his life of restoring property and writing plays, and all of a sudden, you know, 5 years of his life are taken away from him. It's just quite sad.
Yeah, it is. It is. And even though I think I do make this comment in the book that he fared better than a lot of other wrongly accused people, and fared better than he could have if a few factors had changed, like people on the inside of Garrison's case giving the defense some help. If some of those things had not happened, Shaw might not have been acquitted. You know, they might not have become aware of Charles Spiesel and some of those people. But yes, I think however you slice it, the mental strain of dealing with it wore him down. in the early days, I think he thought it was going to go away. I think his attorneys thought it was going to go away. The longer it went on, and then when he was re-indicted, and knowing how easy it is to try to prove, well, you said you didn't know someone, but yeah, we have a witness that says you knew him. Who knows what a jury will do? That kind of pressure can get to you after a while when you're facing a jail sentence, a prison sentence.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Well, Don, thank you very much. I just want to remind people that if you want to know the true story of Clay Shaw, this is the book to get, Man of a Million Fragments. It's an absolutely amazing book. I strongly recommend it. And Don, thank you very much for appearing on the Trail of Delusion.
thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for making everything easy to do.